In 1987, the City of Philadelphia Council passed the new recycling plan. The plan was to encourage through mandation the city's businesses and residents to separate recyclable materials from their trash. In 2 years, the city hoped to have 50% of their trash recycled. Philadelphia would be the first major U.S. city to accomplish such a feat. But in their rush to become the first, the city's ambition doomed them. They rushed through their logistical planning, leaving most of the nuts and bolts of the program to be worked out along the way. They wanted to implement curbside recycling pickup throughout the 141 square mile city. They wanted to penalize people who did not participate in the program by separating their trash. And they wanted businesses who already paid for trash disposal to join in, costing them more expense. In theory, the plan was great. Recycling activists loved it, politicians stood by it, and people who wanted to outgrow the city's nickname of Filthadelphia thought it was a step in the right direction. So what went wrong? To start, the program was expensive. You had to pay for trash collectors to go throughout the city's recycling routes. You had to pay people to work in recycling centers that separated the recyclable materials into piles. You had to pay for the trucks that would collect the trash. And of course, you had to pay for the labor of the program's advisory panel, which overlooked the program and figured out the nuts and bolts along the way. Weekly collection was too expensive for the city's budget, so they had to cut the program to be bi-weekly. The materials had their own worth as well. Trash trucks and recycling trucks are not designed equally, but specialized trucks for recycling were over the budget as well. When the city's trucks were getting too full of materials that weren't worth much, like plastic bottles from milk, soda, etc., the city had to rework their allowed materials to leave out such bulky materials. For residents, keeping up with a bi-weekly pickup schedule, an ever-changing list of approved materials, and adjusting to the new habit of separating their trash was too much. Participation rates were, for lack of a better word, trash. Philadelphia recognized the flaws in their program and tried to fix it. The biggest problem that, if solved, could help the rest was the participation rates. If more people participated, the city could make more profit off of selling their recyclable materials, and then they could afford more specialized trucks, which would collect more materials, and then they could afford a weekly pickup schedule. Seemingly all that they needed was the city's participation. If you've been to Philly, you know the people who live there. They're not super into change, and they're not super into being told what to do. But, as the city discovered, money talks. Cash incentives for neighborhoods that had low participation rates encouraged residents to collect the proper materials and put them out at the proper time. You'd probably remember what day was payday too, wouldn't you? These incentives created the city's reliance on the people who needed the cash the most, the lower class. Incentives also created the lower class's reliance on these cash for trash programs. Two types of people were involved in the city's incentive scheme: the lower class that was paid for participation, and the workers who were paid to separate the large quantity of materials that came from an increased participation. Both of these groups did the same thing. They rooted through trash to find materials worth selling. But the city's employees were better off. Their job came with pay, protective equipment like gloves and masks, and probably a pretty good union as well. The private collectors that were often from the lower class were doing the same job but with less pay, less protection, and no recognition. To this day, 33 years later, Philadelphia still has cash for trash programs. Those who participate are still largely members of the lower class and still working without proper protection. The city has maintained a reliance on this vulnerable group, and the reliance continues to be mutual. As positive as recycling programs seem to be, the dark side of city living still lurks in their shadow.